President Cyril Ramaphosa has also condemned the brutal attacks on Palestinians by Israel. In a series of tweets, Ramaphosa says South Africa is urging the international community to stop this. Let's discuss the story now with Zionist Federation National Chairperson Rowan Polovin. Rowan, a very good morning to you. You've heard the sentiments expressed there by veteran former Minister Ronnie Castles. You've heard what ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking in that capacity, has had to say and expressing his support for the people of Palestine. As the Zionist Federation, what are your thoughts this morning on what's happening there?
Viveka, it's a very serious situation. It is extremely unfortunate that Hamas has decided to launch, as your newsreel showed, indiscriminate rockets at civilian areas in Israel, including Jerusalem, which is a holy city to Jews, Muslims and Christians, and it's an important city around the world. And Hamas has chosen to target Israeli civilians indiscriminately with these attacks, causing fear and terrible situation on the ground in Israel. And we reject this with extreme measures, and we call for restraint, and we call for the restraint of Hamas to reduce their rocket fire and to allow for calm on the ground.
Well, Robert, let's look at where all of this has actually started, is the threatened eviction of several families there in this particular neighborhood, which is Sheikh Jarrah. It's in East Jerusalem, and protesters there trying to prevent Israel from evicting these 8 Palestinian families at the moment. We understand that there were protests against this, but for the Israeli army or Israeli forces to actually storm a mosque during Ramadan prayers, I mean, was that in itself necessary at the time?
Viveka, that's unfortunately a reversal of cause and effect, and I think that this media narrative that this mosque was stormed is completely false. In fact, what happens, there were violent riots and protesters who came there with rocks and with weapons and utensils with an attempt to cause as much havoc as they could. They were unfortunately incited by the Palestinian leadership, and they came there to cause violence. The Israeli forces have done everything they possibly can to reduce tensions, to allow for the freedom of worship in Jerusalem, to allow people to celebrate Ramadan and everything possible. And we call upon the leaders to actually calm the fires and stop stoking the flames. Israel must do what she can to protect her citizens, but also Israel is a democracy. Israel respects the rights of people to pray at their holy sites. And that is a right that must be protected across the board. Jews, Muslims, Christians. We cannot have this use of a very complex case, the case that you mentioned, Sheikh Jarrah, also known as a neighborhood called Shimon HaTzadik. It's a very complex and long-running legal matter. It's very complicated in terms of competing property claims. It's a very small piece of land. There's Jewish owners, the Palestinian tenants. But I think we must allow the courts to deal with that matter. And this is actually a private matter. It's not necessarily an international matter that needs to be imported into other countries. And unfortunately, it has been used to stoke violence. I think it is very important to calm the fires and to allow this to happen, and to actually call for peace and reconciliation.
Well, and I think everybody would want that, Rowan, is peace and reconciliation, especially in this part of the world where we've seen decades of unrest as well. So we even have, though, and I understand you and I can stand here this morning trying to say this side is to blame or that side is to blame, and like you say, there are legalities and things here that the rest of us may not understand. But we even have the UN Human Rights Office now calling on Israel to halt the forced evictions at this point, saying that would flout international law and could be tantamount to a war crime. So to go back there to those evictions as well, I mean, should Jerusalem or should Israel just not back down a little bit at the moment, seeing as how this is escalating?
Well, first of all, I mean, Israel is a system of laws. Israel is a liberal democracy. It has a court system, an incredibly well-respected court system. And this case, in fact, is not new. It's been in the court since 1972. And in fact, the Supreme Court has actually decided to defer the case for 30 days to calm tensions, which I think is a very good move. But, you know, I would call for calm and for the legal system to take its course, and to allow the legal system to take hold. This is not, this is not just a kangaroo court. This is a long-standing, very complex matter. Don't forget that Jerusalem is a city of 3,000 years. It goes back to the days of King David, when he started the city 3,000 years ago as the united capital of the Jewish people. And in the last 100 years, it's been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and then the British Mandate. and since 1948, Israel. So there's competing laws. Jordan, in that particular area, illegally occupied the area from 1948 to 67. There's all kinds of complex issues. We don't have to go in here, but I would allow the courts in Israel to do what their work and to make the fairest and most accurate determination on this.
Well, we spoke to BDS earlier, and you know that they are protesting today. There are marches planned as well in Cape Town as well as here in Johannesburg, also saying that they're calling on South Africans to boycott Israeli products, calling on South Africa not to trade with Israel anymore as well. We even have our own government saying, as you heard, saying that they're on the side of Palestinians. Where does that leave you as the Zionist Federation, as part of South African society? Also, BDS saying that as people who lived under apartheid, who are subjected to that, we should have a little more sympathy towards the Palestinians.
First of all, I utterly reject these insinuations that Israel has an apartheid state or has any apartheid practices. That is an absolutely false attempt to hijack the memory of apartheid under South Africa and import it into a foreign conflict. I think it's extremely problematic, extremely dangerous. I strongly reject any insinuation by BDS that the Jewish state, the only state of Jews in the entire world, the homeland of the Jewish people, is not legitimate. Israel is legitimate. It has a right to exist. It is a right for Jews to express self-determination in a peaceful way, in a way that is in balance with other people in the area, and that is exactly what Israel does. We as the Zionist Federation, we are a South African organization, we believe in peace. We believe in conciliation. We don't talk about incitement. We do not want to divide people. Unfortunately, what you're seeing on the ground in South Africa is an attempt to divide South Africans. Now, that is very dangerous. We are South Africans. We need to build our nation in this country. We can't have organizations who try and drive a wedge between different groups, different religious groups, different belief systems. We need to come together in this country. And I think it's really, really important as our organization, as the Zionist Federation, as other organizations, to call for peace, call for calm, to call for us to work together, and ultimately to call for the Palestinians who come to the negotiation table so that there can be a discussion and a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, some international bodies, like I say, the UN there, Rowan, saying that, key to this might be for Israel, or they're calling on Israel to immediately hold all forced eviction. Do you think, and like you say, this issue is sitting with a court at the moment, so what do you see as the sort of the proper solution to all of this? I mean, this has been going on long enough, and I think everybody agrees on that. But what do you see, and what are you advocating for? What work are you doing here in South Africa to work towards that end game of a peaceful resolution?
Well, first of all, we want South Africans, and in fact, I would say the majority of South Africans do, to believe in Israel, to believe Israel's right to exist, and the right to exist freely as a Jewish state among all the other nations of the world. It's not a big ask. Jews have a long history. We go back thousands of years. We finally returned to our Jewish state in Israel, and Israel has the right to be who she is and to exist. In South Africa, we think it's absolutely important that the South African government plays some kind of peaceful role, plays a mediatory role, does not stoke the flames. I think it was very problematic that the South African government and certain personalities are getting involved in a foreign conflict. I think there are enough issues in South Africa for the government and other parties to be dealing with, not some kind of foreign conflict to import and perhaps deflect attention on local issues. Jerusalem is a holy city. It's a city that has a right to exist. It's been going, as I said, for thousands of years, and we call on peace. We pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and in fact, I would say that the majority of South Africans do the same. I would say the majority of South Africans love Israel, are peaceful people, and do not want any violence, do not want protests. They just want peace, and they want Israel to exist freely like any other country.
Rowan, do you at all sympathize, though, with those Palestinian families that are now facing being kicked out of homes that many of them have lived in for most of their lives? Do you feel for them? Like you say, you're very in touch with, the comparisons that are being made between apartheid in South Africa and what's happening there in Israel, particularly Jerusalem at the moment. Do you sympathize with those Palestinian families at all? Do you feel for them?
I certainly feel for individual people, and I feel individual people, the Palestinians, have very bad leadership. Their leadership tells them not to accept peace. Their leadership tells them to accept war and violence. I mean, we've seen some terrible comments from the Palestinian Authority and Hamas stoking the flames. You spoke earlier about rockets. How can that be right? How can teaching kids at schools in Palestinian cities to hate, teaching people that Israel doesn't exist? Even with the protests we've seen here, we've been shown maps that actually show one single state of Palestine. It doesn't even show the state of Israel. I mean, how can that be right when people are trying to wipe Israel off the map? And these citizens, these Palestinians in these areas, they are working through the courts. They are using the Israel justice system as any Israeli can as well. And like I said, let's see how the courts solve this issue in the most equitable way. The courts have already tried to do that, by the way. They've tried to find compromises, which unfortunately have been rejected by some of these families. Let's hope that some commonality, some rationality, and some sense can prevail in the situation.
And I don't think that we could possibly paint all Palestinians with the same brush in any kind of conflict like this, Rowan. You're going to get propaganda coming through from both sides. So, in terms of leadership, yes, I think we criticize leadership throughout the country. But in terms of the actual Palestinian people on the ground, I don't think that that they feel the same way as to wipe out Israel in its current state.
Well, I mean, of course, there's multiple people. I would say most Palestinians also just want to get on with their lives. They want also to live in a democratic state. And, it's unfortunate that the Palestinian Authority has delayed and cancelled elections. They haven't had any form of democracy virtually ever. They live in a terror state in Gaza. It's really important for the Palestinians to have better leadership, to have people who actually call for solutions, do not incite their people. But of course, I mean, one has to feel for the average Palestinian, living in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority in a non-democratic way. And I think it's important that we get to a point where there can be, like other Arab states. I mean, it's remarkable that in the last year you've had the United Arab Emirates, you've had Bahrain, you've had Morocco here in Africa, Sudan, actually making peace with Israel, saying actually, let's put down our weapons, let's put down our rhetoric, let's actually make peace to improve the lives on the ground. And, I would call for the Palestinian Authority and Hamas to do the same, to improve the lives of their citizens.
And do you believe that Israeli leaders are doing the same? Do you believe they're doing the best they can to resolve this conflict?
Israel wants peace. Israel has done everything she can for decades for peace. The moment that the Palestinians put down their weapons, tomorrow there will be peace. They just want a peaceful resolution of this conflict. No one wants to live in this life of terror, this life of rockets, people having to run to shelters. It's a terrible, terrible situation. Israel wants peace. Israel has shown its ability to make peace. Israel's made peace with Egypt and Jordan, two neighbors that historically were at war. Israel, as I said, has made peace with other nations in the last year. Remarkable peace. But Israel has done everything she can, and this is really the only solution. Call the Palestinian Authority, come to the negotiation table, sit down in direct talks with Israel, work out the borders, work out all these issues that, in fact, are easily solvable. They've been discussed around the conference table for years. They are actually not as complicated as it seems. And I think there is possibility, but there needs to be the right leadership.
Well, Rowan, understandably, you would imagine that everybody would want peace in a situation like this. But with Israel retaliating with things like airstrikes, where 20 people, including children, have died, I just wonder how you could say that Israel wants peace in this.
Well, I mean, Rebecca, if you listen, imagine if we were sitting in Johannesburg or Cape Town or any city in South Africa, and suddenly you have terror, you have rockets firing down literally on your houses. You have to run with your children to shelters. Literally, you have 10 to 30 seconds notice. How would you expect Israel to respond? Israel has an absolute right and obligation to protect her citizens, but in a way that is fair and in a way that doesn't stoke the flames. And Israel is extremely careful to minimize casualties. I mean, one of the big questions is, why is Hamas firing rockets from civilian areas? Why are they deliberately firing rockets from schools and hospitals, as we have seen in the past, and we have even seen last night, from civilian areas in Gaza? Why are they doing that? Why are they using their own population as human shields? Israel must do everything she can to protect her civilians, and the Palestinians should not be putting their own civilians on the firing line. We call for calm. I want the situation desperately to be resolved. And the Palestinians need to actually love their citizens, not put their own citizens in harm's way. and actually call for peace. That is the only solution. We cannot go on these endless cycles of violence, these endless cycles of incitement. But on the other hand, Israel must protect her citizens, must defend her citizens, must diminish casualties, and that is exactly what Israel is doing.
And I hear you, Rowan. It just, just looking at the latest casualties here, though, it seems that the casualties on the Palestinian side far outweigh what we've seen on the Israeli side.
I don't think it's fair to make these kind of equivalences. You're talking about the majority of people on the Palestinian side are Hamas operatives. When a Palestinian civilian is killed, is absolutely tragic, and I promise you, we all mourn when innocent civilians are murdered. It is absolutely shocking, but the question is, who is to blame? Who is to blame when innocent civilians are taken down in civilian areas that are firing rockets into Israel? It is a tragic, tragic situation. In Israel does everything she can to protect her citizens. She warns her citizens. There's a sophisticated system where people run to shelters. There's the Iron Dome, which attacks these rockets in the air. But why is Hamas doing the opposite? Why is Hamas putting their own civilians in harm's way? I think we must be very, very circumspect when we look at these numbers, when we see numbers coming out of Gaza. The majority of these people are Hamas operatives. Israel does everything she possibly can to reduce civilian casualties.
Right. Well, Rowan Polovin, thank you very much. Like I say, we could be talking about this all day, but the common denominator here, I suppose, the common call is that this should end peacefully, as we heard from BDS as well earlier. Everybody wants a peaceful solution to this. And where you stand in South Africa, we've heard calls there for South Africans to boycott Israeli products, for South Africa to stop doing any trade with Israel. And let's see how that pans out. And hopefully the message gets across there that this needs to be, that there needs to be no loss of life in this